Okay, and welcome back. Once a month we get to travel over to Japan, to Tokyo, and talk to the former Asia-Pacific Bureau Chief of Forbes magazine, Mr. Benjamin Fulford, for an hour. Ben is our resident optimist and financial expert analyst in his own way. He has a unique worldview, and it's always fascinating to hear from him. Hi, Ben. Welcome back.
Hi, it's nice to be back.
What have you been doing?
Things are definitely coming to a head, I would have to say.
Well, if you're looking at Greece, yes, and I'd like to get your view on the Greece situation. Japan, of course, is being talked about as being, well, bordering on insolvency, and then Toyota has to recall another 50,000 cars from another line of its product inventory, the Sequoia SUV. So I don't know if this is all being done.
Let's start with the Greece situation.
Yeah.
Essentially, what happened was, before they decided to make the euro, the Germans, with their very powerful Deutschmark, were very, very worried about the easy spending Mediterraneans. I think the example I give is, imagine a beautiful blonde heiress with this,
A beautiful blonde what? Airhead?
Heiress, a rich lady,
sorry.
right?
All right.
With this kind of playboy Mediterranean fiancé.
Could be a
says, look, if we're going to get married, you have to, play it straight, and they do so. Like, they're supposed to have a budget deficit of less than 3% of GDP before they could join the euro. Right? But as soon as they join the euro, it's party time. It's like, okay, now I got the marriage license, I got the money, I can go and be a playboy again, And so now their deficit is, 14% or something? It's 4 times more than they're supposed to be allowed to. Mm-hmm. And they're lying about it. And basically, it's the Germans who have to pay. And they say, hey, why should we retire at 67 so the Greeks can retire at 63? And they basically say, we're not going to pay these people. And what's going to happen? I don't see any way other than for the euro to disappear. I'm pretty sure it's going to be replaced by a Mediterranean currency, which will then make it very cheap to travel to Italy, Greece, to Spain, and Portugal.
All right, so the EU is going. The EU, Ben, the EU. You're predicting the EU is going to fragment.
Oh, I'm saying it's the euro, the currency. Well,
the EU will go right with it probably, but all right, go ahead.
Well, probably, but yeah, I mean, they still have some maybe not paying duties and other.
They'll have tariff and trade. I understand.
But the idea of a fascist Soviet Europe, I think is coming to an end. And it'll start with the Mediterranean countries breaking off. And there's no way they're going to fix that situation. It's just not possible. The Greeks need to get out of the euro and devalue their currency.
I concur.
And I would like to say also the United States is basically facing the same problem. They have to get out of the dollar. Amazingly, people, they always say, why doesn't China revalue the yuan, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that U.S. exports can be more competitive. But that's not the problem. The problem is that the currency that Americans use needs to be devalued. But 90% of the dollars ever created are not owned by Americans, and they don't want these dollars to be devalued.
They're overseas.
But because the U.S. government, more accurately, the Federal Reserve Board and the Corporation of Washington, D.C., don't want to give up that dollar printing press, they're forcing the American economy down the tank through unemployment. So either you put out a new currency that buys less from the rest of the world, which forces you to buy more American and then boosts your economy, or you pretend that you're still okay with these dollars and your manufacturing industry will continue to disintegrate because you can't compete. Mm-hmm. So you're worse than Greece, would be my answer. Only your government is lying through the teeth about everything, so it's very hard to get accurate data.
Well, that's a given.
But I would say that they say, Greece's deficit is over 100% of GDP. Well, the latest I figured out is that your deficit is something like 800% of your GDP.
That wouldn't surprise me.
And they just put it off the books and lie about it and fudge the numbers. But, the opinion polls, I'm sure you saw that Pew Research showing 92% of Americans think the economy is bad. and 80% don't trust the government.
Correct.
So whatever feel-good stuff you're seeing in the corporate media, it's obviously nobody's believing it, or a very small percent of hardcore brainwashees. Now, getting back to the Toyota thing, it's clearly they're picking on Toyota. They're finding like tiny little things, and just it's a kind of a game against Japan. But what they don't realize is that the Americans begged Toyota back in the 80s to build factories in America to give jobs to Americans, and that's what they did. And now they're trying to take these jobs away from the Americans who work for Toyota in the United States.
Right.
So it's really a very petty and stupid thing. It shows the low level of your government's mentality to do such a thing. It's just total foolishness. Now, on the Japan side, yes, this country is bankrupt. It has been for a while, and they've been fudging their books. However, unlike Greece and the United States, the Japanese borrow oil from other Japanese almost entirely. Mm-hmm. That means they don't have to listen to what foreigners tell them in order to fix their problem.
I see.
They just have to kind of talk among themselves.
That's quite an advantage.
But basically, it's going to mean lower pensions for the retiring baby boomers. That's the bottom line here. Mm-hmm. This ain't the money and ain't the young people to support them. And there will be something. They might. I mean, I've been recommending that they close the banks here and then fix up the financial system, reboot it. Perhaps with a new currency. A yen used to be like $100 bill. You'd have these things like a sen and a sen under it, right? Mm-hmm. I'd like to have that again, like I have a 1 yen be worth like a $100 bill. And then when they do that, they can then fix the numbers and straighten everything out. And then the government doesn't have to spend everybody's money paying back debt. So that's the sort of situation here. And a lot of things are happening under the surface, too. And a lot of it, actually, I'm not allowed to talk about. I've been asked specifically by several different groups not to talk about it. But there are very, very serious negotiations coming to a head right now about the new financial system. And if everything works, then you people are going to see the biggest changes in your country since 1776.
A lot of Americans are ready and willing to accept real changes here.
I believe it's going to happen, I think it's probably going to be the Pentagon folk who are going to finally do the right thing. There's just serious horse trading still going on, and the people, in Washington, D.C., I mean, they're not going to go out quietly into the night. They're not. They're going to go kicking and screaming and frothing at the mouth, and nothing other than extreme measures is probably going to result in final solutions to the problem.
Are you talking about bloodshed?
Well, arrests at the most. I heard that 18 Federal Reserve Board officials, especially in Dallas, were arrested this past weekend, for example.
Now, where did you hear that?
From one of my sources, a lawyer who's involved in a lawsuit on behalf of an outfit known as CMX. They're suing the...
Ben, let me ask you a question.
$3.8 trillion.
Ben, hold on. 18 Federal Reserve high-level officers arrested last weekend, and not one word about it in the media?
Well, go to the FBI homepage. I'm not sure. It's not 18 Federal Reserve Board officials. 18 bankers, including Dallas Federal Reserve Board officials. I
don't see how they're going to keep it out of the news. Well, I know they can, but they're just, it's not going to happen.
Well, we'll see.
This is another one of those stories with unattributed sources quoted, unnamed officials cited, which has no legs and no verification. And the Internet is full of that stuff.
That's not true. I didn't get this from one of those sites that you're probably
I know. You listen. That doesn't mean your sources, in turn, could not have bitten on an empty hook either.
This is true. However, like I say, if you go to the FBI homepage, right, and my source for this one, by the way, is Al Hodges, who was one of the lawyers in the CMKX shareholders lawsuit, okay?
Okay.
So that's my source. It's not some site on the Internet. And there are other confirmations. What happens is they've arrested thousands of bankers and over 100 have been killed. But you don't see the headline, 1,000 bankers arrested. You don't see 100 bankers killed. What you see is one story about a banker being found in the bottom of a swimming pool. Another story about a banker shooting himself in the head.
Yeah, well, there's been a few of those.
The arrest, they say, okay, they arrest 5 here. Maybe you read about 5 bankers being arrested. But if you look at it, over time, you'll see there's been thousands of arrests of bankers. There is financial warfare going on, and it is the judicial authorities who are taking these bank gangsters down. And the media they own, owned by these banksters, they don't report it. Of course they don't.
Yeah. All right, hold on there, Ben. Just a second. Hang on. We'll be right back with Benjamin Fulford live in Tokyo in just a few. Okay, back with Ben Fulford in Tokyo, getting his take on lots of different things. Okay, Ben, please continue.
Well, the other big sign of change, of course, is that they've finally gone after that most sacred of sacred cows, Goldman Sachs. Now, I'm still not completely sure they're really going after them. I worry that they might be doing what they say in Japan is having the lizard shake off its tail. In other words, they have a civil lawsuit instead of a criminal lawsuit,
right?
And they throw 1 or 2 young traders to the wolves and hope they can then get away, you know? And if that happens, then it'll obviously just be a cover-up. But I'm suspecting that once they open this can of worms, there will be no shutting it, and they won't be able to do that. The more people find out about how much they've been robbed and conned by Wall Street, the more repercussions are going to be. Because they were doing fraud, pure and simple. There's no other word for it. And now finally, the chickens are coming home to roost. They thought, they got away with it for so long. I guess they got arrogant. They thought they could get away with it forever. And they thought they could do one of their managed economic crises in the United States and set up a fascist world government, but no, it's just not working. And that's my take on things. But I don't think it's over yet. We still have that idiot actor Obama reading his scripts, his Soros scripts all over the place. And you still have horrific wars going on. And
well, the Americans, as you know, Ben, are losing. They have been losing in Afghanistan. They just had to withdraw from a strategic valley after suffering heavy casualties over quite a length of time. In fact, the troops there were complaining that they were simply put out there as bait to try to attract the resistance fighters so they could be destroyed. And a lot of Americans, anyway, they gave up and pulled out. So it's a strategic defeat, not a strategic withdrawal for the Americans in Afghanistan. No way to win there unless they can buy off the opposition.
In Vietnam, that was set up in the same way. It was on a hilltop, completely exposed.
It happened to many groups over there, you're right.
Yeah, but, this whole, like I said, at the end of the day, what these people wanted was long, drawn-out wars so they could keep selling overpriced military equipment to both sides. They didn't want a quick war where the U.S. just wins and it's all over because they don't make enough money. So, to me, the whole thing is still stage-managed. They're still playing both sides, financing both sides. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda get their orders from CIA, and U.S. troops get their orders from the Pentagon, and the whole thing is a farce. And what are they doing? They're protecting the big drug trade. They're gangsters, and I think they're finally being brought to justice. I'd also like to get back to a different topic, which is related to what these people have been doing. Did you get to see the movie Avatar yet?
Nope, I don't go to movies. Don't have time anymore.
Anyway, the story is about these people in a jungle protecting a tree from big corporations who want to tear it down to get at the minerals underneath. And the reason I find that very interesting is that I was in, when I was young, 17, I was in Pucallpa in northern Peru, staying with the Shipibo Indians. And they had a giant tree there, which they were trying to protect from destruction and stop the oil companies. And the interesting thing was that there was a big American middle-class neighborhood in that town. It's an impoverished, developing country town. And what these people were doing, their job, was to translate the Bible into every language on earth. So they'd go out with these airplanes and try to discover pots, mirrors, things like that. And they had microphones hidden. And they would try to guess the language, and after a while, they would, try to make the people understand their friendly, and they would land and go and try to convert them into Christianity. You think that's an awful lot of money and trouble to spend, and now theoretically to save their eternal souls. But I now realize what they were trying to do was turn these people into slaves. And Christ and all that stuff. But the original creators of that religion deliberately inserted a couple of important ideas. One is the idea of turning the other cheek. Well, they slap you, turn the other cheek, and they slap the other cheek, and they kill you. Well, it doesn't matter, because after you die, you go to heaven, and they go to hell. But while you're alive, you just got to put up with it. That's the one big fallacy. The other one, of course, is to give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Well, why is it Caesar's? Because he seized it? Anyway, the point is that, we have a real-life situation, even to this day, with these big corporations trying to destroy this ancient forest, and these natives fighting to protect it. And this is what the U.S. corporations have been doing all over the world, destroying the planet in the name of greed, destroying the United States in the name of greed, and for what? I remember visiting a shaman who's living in a shanty town, a horrible little shack, surrounded by garbage and stuff. And his fellow shaman, they still haven't destroyed the forest around where he is. He has a nice hut beside the river. You can go swimming and fishing, and which is a better lifestyle.
Yeah. Hang on right there, Ben. That's a good place to pause. We'll pick it up in just a minute. Ben Fulford in Tokyo. Always like to hear Ben's take on things. Very interesting. Back in just a couple. Okay, back with Ben Fulford. Did you happen to catch the Telegraph story about the 9-hour testimony before a U.S. Congressional Committee in which Mr. Blankfein said that he felt that there was absolutely no moral obligation on the part of Goldman to be honest with its clients?
Well, that's what happens. You have a conflict of interest, which is what they do. In other words, when they got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act, they allowed them to once again trade both their money, other people's money, and their own money at the same time. And, of course, they make sure they profit and the other people don't. That's why they separated commercial banking from investment banking in the first place. So when you have a system where you're just tempted, I mean, you know, to use other people's money, then there's a problem. And this whole thing started with Clinton and Greenspan. And again, I don't believe this is an accident. I don't believe this was a cause of, you know, just speculative excess and regulatory mistakes. I still think it was deliberate, planned economic sabotage against the United States of America. They knew exactly what they were doing, and there was a long-term plan, and it was aimed at creating a fascist, that is to say corporate-controlled,
right,
non-democratic world government.
Correct. Agreed.
They allowed you to have 100 times leverage. Then they pumped up the real estate market. They made hundreds and hundreds of times profits. They did all the profits in the Cayman Islands.
Yep.
And then they crashed the market, and they were going to buy the whole U.S. up in pennies to the dollar, like they've been doing since time immemorial, except that they were stopped this time. And they were stopped because they were using mostly Asian and some Middle Eastern money to do this, and the Asians and the Middle Eastern said, hey, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to finance you crazy people. And this is the thing that people still in the rich countries in the U.S. and Europe fail to understand about this crisis. It's not a global financial crisis. It's a rich country crisis. And it's happened because the rest of the world has stopped subsidizing you. That's all it really boils down to. In other words, the Greek crisis is partly because the Chinese and the Japanese and stuff aren't putting money into your military machine, and so suddenly you have a much smaller pie, and then you start fighting over it. And the Germans, who still work hard and make stuff and save money, say, hey, we're not going to subsidize all these people. And neither are the Chinese, which means, and this is true of the Americans too, you're just going to have to work harder and earn less for a while. And that's the reality of the situation you're facing. But unfortunately, it didn't have to turn out this way. You didn't have to lose all your industrial base to China, for example. And you didn't have to make it so that most of your economy is paper chasing paper without anything real underneath. It was bad governance. And
some would say, what governance? We've got
criminal
treason.
governance.
We've got treason. Absolutely.
The worst sort.
There you go. Treason in the Congress, a traitor in the White House, a Supreme Court that is no longer weighing the scales of justice accurately and honestly. It is creating constitutional law as it goes.
Absolutely. They thought that, they were going to be able to suddenly come out in the open and say, yes, we're fascist dictators and you're our slaves and there's nothing you can do about it. But they forgot that they need to have enforcers to do that. And the enforcers have to come from the people. But since they come from the people, they ultimately listen to the people. And this is what is happening. I just don't believe the Pentagon is going to turn against the American people. I cannot imagine. I know how these people think. I think they're a little bit narrow-minded and stubborn, but they are patriotic, and they do believe they have to fight for the right cause. Otherwise, they don't want to fight. And this is what's happening. It's the military who's going to come in. I'm hearing, again, I don't want to get stuck on dates because, it's such a volatile situation.
Sure.
But I am hearing that some action is happening soon. And there's stuff you can sort of see, like, if you look at this recent G20 meeting, it was last week, there's few signs there. One is that the IMF was clearly fighting for its life. They were suddenly saying, well, yeah, okay, maybe we caused a lot of poor people to be miserable, but we'll change our ways now. And then they're saying, oh, yeah, and okay, maybe our management used to be controlled just by rich old white men, but we'll change that too. But it's too little, too late. I think that institution is going to be downgraded or maybe even eliminated. I just don't see it continuing as is. This is the sort of thing that you won't find reported about in the corporate media, but you can see from their statements that there's clearly no agreement. And
right.
if you look at,
let me go back, if I can, Ben, please.
Mm-hmm.
Toyota.
Yes.
It looks to me, my sense of it is that this is another designed attack on a very powerful and profitable corporation by the enemies of success, unless it's their own success. It looks to me like Toyota has been singled out. That's the way it looks over here.
Yeah, but they've only been singled out in the United States. The Japanese government hasn't found any problem with their safety. The Chinese government hasn't.
That's funny. I hadn't heard that. Yeah.
It's something. It's the, if you look at the details, they say, okay, the new cars, they stop at within 13 feet instead of 12 and a half feet. So let's fine them for that. Stuff like that. And I do believe, my sources here tell me also they were ordered to put a microchip in their cars that allowed police to override the vehicle. And I believe that's true of American cars, too. And they've been messing with those chips deliberately to try to sabotage that company's reputation in the United States. This is what I'm hearing. Remember, I used to cover the auto industry for Forbes and stuff. So it's not just a case of a company that used to have a really high quality suddenly going downhill. It's just a case of the Americans being angry at the Japanese because the Japanese have stopped buying U.S. government bonds because they don't want to finance the giant military machine that's impoverished them over the past 30 years. And I have direct sources, okay, in the Japanese military, police, security establishment who tell me very clearly that they will no longer assassinate Japanese politicians or journalists or, government officials on behalf of the Americans. And this whole worldwide policy of the United States of assassination and bribery has created an awful lot of enemies everywhere in the world.
Well, it's got to come home to roost, and it won't be too soon for many. Back with Ben Fulford in a minute. Japan, by the way, is opening its first overseas military base since World War II in the Horn of Africa. That announcement came today. It'll be a naval facility. So talk to Ben about Japan's militarism and where it may or may not be going. And we'll do that in just a couple minutes. Okay, our conversation with Ben. One more segment to go. So Japan extends its military muscle, such as it is, its presence, into Africa, where everybody seems to be vying and trying to get a piece of the action. The Chinese, of course, apparently in the lead. The U.S. Still playing games of death in Sudan, which is an enormous territory. The Japanese are right there in the Horn of Africa, just above Sudan, near Ethiopia, and below the trouble spots, Yemen and the other areas. So what are they doing by opening a naval base there, Ben?
Well, the Japanese armed forces are actually quite huge and a lot more powerful than people have realized. They call themselves self-defense forces, and I don't believe that there's ever going to be a return to militarism. But I believe they're setting up to replace what they believe will be a vacuum as the U.S. starts to scale down its military presence worldwide. The Americans simply are not able to afford 800 bases anymore worldwide. And the Japanese rely very much on the shipping that goes through that area. And so they need to start protecting it themselves. And I also believe that they're going to step in. I mean, they want to continue a military alliance with the United States. The Japanese military, I point this out, wishes to remain allied militarily to the United States. But they do not like the government in Washington, D.C. So they feel that government is going to go and they're going to stay allied to the American people. but they realized there's going to be a huge gap to fill. I mean, there's a lot of talk about the U.S. bases in Japan. And basically, I've heard from someone at the Pentagon and also the Japanese are saying they're going to have to probably withdraw a lot of those troops from Japan, too. You just can't afford to be the world's policeman because the world doesn't want to pay you to be the policeman anymore because you weren't acting like a policeman. You were acting like a thug or a gangster. You weren't protecting. You were robbing. That's what happened in Iraq. That's what happened in Afghanistan. That's what you've been doing in places like the Congo. You've been stealing resources instead of guarding people. So I believe this is part of a big thing. It's not just the United States. The Russians conducted a huge naval exercise with all their top fleets in the Sea of Japan, in between Japan and China. I think what they're saying is to the Japanese, hey, listen, if push comes to shove, the Americans aren't going to fight the Chinese for you, but we will because we share a border with them just like you do. So there's a lot of posturing we're preparing for what's going to take place after the collapse of the post-World War II structures. That includes, I believe, the United Nations as it stands now, the IMF, the National Security Council, and NATO. I believe the Europeans are eventually going to just ally themselves with Russia. So a lot of big changes are happening. And there's a lot of still fighting and murdering on. I'm sure, for example, the Polish government was assassinated. But I'm not sure if that was the Russians who did it or the Europeans who did it. It would seem pretty stupid of the Russians to do it inside Russian territory on the anniversary of the Katyn massacre.
Does seem a little dumb, I agreed. Yeah.
It reminds me of the Litvinenko case where they have this guy killed in England and they have a trace of radioactive evidence going all the way back to Russia. It's just too contrived.
Right.
So I suspect they're trying to frame the Russians here, but I'm not sure on this one. But whatever it was just not a normal plane crash. I think everybody who's following...
Everybody knows that. It's like the Ron Brown assassination. They guided the plane right down into the ground. It's very easy to do. Who did it?
Yeah.
I don't know. But there was one stewardess who survived the Ron Brown. This was Air Force 2, remember, folks, who survived the Ron Brown plane crash and was walking around when the first American helicopter crew arrived. She was medevaced out of there, but unfortunately was found to be dead when the helicopter finally landed at a medical facility. So he was found, of course, with a gunshot.
I think I've talked about it before, but I want to talk about it again. In 1985, a Japan Airlines flight with 500 people on board flew around, missing half its tail for a couple hours. The U.S. refused to let them land at a U.S. military base. They crashed in the Japanese Alps. A U.S. helicopter showed up at the scene but didn't help anybody. And the Japanese rescue teams weren't allowed in there until about 24 hours later. And there was still one survivor, a stewardess. But she refuses to talk. But the people at the Japanese security police have told me the United States shot that airplane down with a missile. The United States being the CIA, George Bush Sr., Nazi criminal nexus within your government structure, deliberately shot that plane down in order to force the Japanese to sign the Plaza Accords, which basically ruined their economy. People forget, but it used to be Japan is number one, everybody was middle class, fast economic growth, and suddenly the last 2 decades, well, this was pure thuggery that caused that to happen. But these people have been doing it worldwide. Another one, and I hope maybe you could put this up on your page and do some of the research, but the Titanic was deliberately smashed into an iceberg, and then they, at gunpoint, forced all these financiers to stay on board and die. And remember, it was J.P. Morgan who said, let's all work out our differences on the transatlantic cruise. Let's all get there and talk. And he didn't get on the boat at the last minute. And the J.P. Morgan is the same people basically behind George Bush Sr. to this day. It's the same racially supremacist, eugenicist, Nazi cabal. And they've done an awful lot of harm to humanity. And I believe that worldwide there's a movement to take these people down, or at least to turn them away from their genocidal tendencies and make them more decent again. because there was good stuff about the Nazis. They invented a lot of stuff. They treated the German workers well. And it says the trains ran on time.
Well, they invented
a
lot of things. They were mass
murderers and torturers and sadists.
Well, now, hold on. So were the Americans, so were the British, so were the Russians. Nobody came away from that thing with clean hands. Don't believe it for a minute. You people out there know damn well that it's a lie. We're just as dirty and filthy as anything the Germans did, the Nazis did.
Okay, it's true that Victor is the history and that all the incredible war crimes of the Allies...
You should look at a book sometime of the German freeway system that Hitler ordered built in the 30s.
Okay, look,
it covered the whole country.
They did a lot of good stuff. But
I'm not done.
Hold on. So did the British.
Yeah, hold on. I'm not done. Let me finish.
There is a faction that has taken over a large part of your government under...
Right. You're right. No, you're right. Let me finish. I got two more things to add that people don't know about, Ben. They don't know this. The German government had the world's first mass anti-smoking campaign, the world's first massive anti-cancer public health awareness campaign, and you talk about the science and the inventions and the technology, and, well, it's legendary. I mean, this has all been obfuscated and hidden since the end of the war. But go ahead, please. I just wanted to put those out there because people don't know.
It is very true. What I'm saying is that there's a faction now that believes in eugenics. They're trying to create a super race, and they were planning to kill 4 billion people. And I know because they offered me to join them.
Well, they're going to kill more than that.
And I'd also like to conclude, like, people say, whatever happened to the ninjas, right? And the fact of the matter is that since the Chinese stood up, the world has turned upside down. People used to say, oh, yeah, China will become a superpower in 20 or 50 years. And now it suddenly just happened. You had the Olympics, then you have this whole turn. Everyone's going down to China now to suck up to them. And you had the Lehman crisis. You have the U.S. government going around everywhere, Obama bending down and kissing people, begging for money. And I was in China, by the way, a couple of weeks ago, and I talked to a senior source directly linked to the Politburo who was at the meeting where former U.S. Treasury Secretary Paulson and Geithner were literally on their knees begging for money. On their knees.
Yeah.
And this is not something I heard on the Internet. I heard from someone who was there. I was in Beijing. Okay?
I'd love to see it. I don't know if I can take that to the bank, so to speak, but literally, figuratively is one thing. They were begging.
Senior official said he witnessed this, okay?
All right. Well.
But the point is that they're not getting the money. And there really is a lot of funky stuff happening behind the scenes. I wish I could talk about it more, but things are at a very sensitive stage, and it's not a time to talk. But believe me, there's a lot of high-powered people worldwide working to save the American people from their criminal government. And it's just a matter of time. I'm sure of it. They're still fighting. They're still dragging. But their circle is getting smaller and smaller. They have fewer and fewer allies as time goes on. You can see it by looking at the world. You can see it by looking at the meetings, the voting patterns in the UN. The evidence is everywhere if you just care to look.
True. Yeah. Well, I hope you're right. I hope your optimism comes home and cleans this place like a Hoover vacuum. It's full of.
And you got to remember, the thing is that the rest of the world is doing really great these days. Okay, Africa's humming, South America's humming, India, China, 12% growth, Japan, 40% growth in exports, everywhere except the United States, Southern Europe, and Britain.
Those are the target areas. They're being taken down.
They've been in debt for the past 20 years, and now they're being told they can't borrow anymore. They have to start tightening their belt and working harder, which is a good thing in the long run. But they're kicking and fighting and doing everything they can to avoid reality, but you cannot avoid reality forever.
No, you can't. No, you can't. Ben, thanks for the time. Great to talk to you, as always. We'll find out what happens between now and the end of May. Talk to you next time.
Yeah, I won't give you a date, but things are happening, big things.
Okay. Well, you said it right here. You're on record.
Okay.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah.
Good night. Benjamin Fulford. All right, very good. Thanks for being here. It's always a pleasure to share your company. Be back tomorrow night with a very interesting program. Shiv Chopra is going to be here to talk about GM foods and things like that. It's quite a story. Stephen Snagowski, Peter Jostling will be here. But anyway, busy night tomorrow night as always. See you then. In the meantime, you know where we'll be. Thanks for tuning in tonight. Take care.
Known worldwide as the most consistently fascinating, informative, and unique program on radio, the Jeff Rense program can be yours to listen to anytime, anywhere, whenever you want to hear it. For pennies a day, our subscribers can download any of Jeff's thousands of programs featuring a treasury of newsmakers, researchers, eyewitnesses, and incredible subjects, all in MP3 commercial-free, crystal-clear 56-bit digital sound, and take these often unforgettable programs with them wherever they go. As a subscriber, you can also listen live at airtime, online, anywhere in the world, or browse through our archives of over 6,000 hours of legendary broadcasts. Subscribe now by taking the link at the top of Rense.com and enrich your mind with the most unique panorama of vital information and the best independent, honest journalism in radio. Look for the Subscribe Now link on Rense.com and give yourself the knowledge you need for these unprecedented times.